In the early 2000s, the notion of meaning arrived in business. Giving meaning had become an essential concept. But I never heard anyone tell me clearly what this meaning really consisted of that had to be provided imperatively in the world of work, in business, and in management. And, at the time, completely by chance, I came across the work of Viktor Frankl, the psychologist specialized in meaning. So, I was necessarily interested in a psychology that spoke of meaning at a time when we were talking in the world of management about giving meaning. Frankl was at first under the influence of Freud, who was the master thinker in the psychological field of the Viennese circle, and whose genius fascinated him. Freud's genius fascinated Frankl, as it fascinated many others, by the way. But Frankl quickly separated himself from Freud because he could not accept this Freudian, materialistic, and deterministic vision of the human being. So, Frankl began to practice first as a doctor from the 1930s on, and to practice his psychiatry, neurology, etc., and his psychotherapy. And to develop this theory, which posed the question of meaning in psychology for the first time. So, he worked like that until the war, and as a Jew, he was deported by the Nazis in 1942 with his wife and his parents and his whole family. And he came back in 1945, the only survivor. And he then finalizes his theory, which he called logotherapy, therapy by logos. So the logos is a Greek word that means many things, but in this case, which means the meaning, therefore therapy by meaning. So, he finalized his theory, which is called logotherapy in its therapeutic, psychotherapeutic aspect, and is called existential analysis in its philosophical, anthropological version. That is to say, it is the same thought, but with a philosophical version very largely enriched by existentialist philosophy. And this vision describes a human being in a fundamental quest for meaning in his life, who is endowed with free will, therefore with freedom and responsibility. And this freedom, this responsibility, this free will emanate from a specific human dimension for Frankl. And therefore the existential analysis, which is the philosophical version of anthropology, that is to say this vision of man, which proposes to the individual to behave as a human being towards himself and towards others. And what is a human being? He is someone who uses his conscience. He is someone who wants to be free to exercise his will. He is someone who feels responsible for what he does, as well as for what he does not do. And so, the first part of my essay is devoted to the positioning of Frankl's psychology in the environment of the materialist and determinist psychologies of his time being the first half of the 20th century. And these most famous materialist and determinist psychologies were first psychoanalysis, and then behaviorism. These materialistic psychologies were based on the convictions and assertions of the science of the time, Darwin's science, classical physics, which denied any dimension other than material to the universe and its components, and therefore also to man and his psyche. Frankl, as a doctor, as a scientist, adhered to the scientific knowledge of his time. He accepted the determinism of the universe and its contents, with one exception, man. He was convinced that animals were entirely conditioned by their instincts and determined by their past, and therefore totally devoid of free will. But he could not accept this for man. He could therefore only reject this thesis, a thesis that had been deployed and then still exists in the scientific world, namely that human free will is only a pseudo-free will, a mental construction that is the fruit of the evolution of man. So, Frankl, when he develops his thinking based on the dimensions of the mind and consciousness and free will, is in a delicate situation in the scientific context, in the intellectual world of his universe at the time. But significantly, at the same time, that is to say, in the 1920s, the dominant science, the science that we call classical, showed some inadequacies, which opened the way to new reflections that turned out to be astonishing. As much in physics as in cosmology as in the life sciences, from theories of evolution to neurobiology, there were new data, new reflections, new experiments that allowed the development of astonishing hypotheses compared to the 2 previous centuries. First, the universe seemed to have a purpose, which was the appearance of life. Then life seemed to have a purpose, which was the appearance of consciousness. And then consciousness seemed to have a purpose, which was the existence of real free will. The only element of indeterminacy, for example, in physics, in a universe entirely determined since the first second of time. And so, the second part of the essay is devoted to these reflections. It is obviously not based on my reflections, but on those of some of the greatest scientists of the 20th century, including many Nobel Prize winners.
To complete the questions we had planned, you took 2 years at the time of a personal questioning on precisely what was the meaning of life a priori according to what you explained to us and the meaning that you gave to your work, and in what way ultimately logotherapy allowed you to find a meaning for yourself.
So, as I said, it's been a good 10 years since I was seduced by this thought of Frankl, which is based on this idea that he largely built through his thousands of consultations. He is a practitioner who worked for almost 60 years, and who therefore based his theory and confirmed his theories on experiences and experiments and observations, on consultations. And so, it seems obviously relevant to me, because it speaks to me, but with a small problem for me, which I'd continued to have in mind, because I have a scientific background, modestly scientific. But enough to be a little bothered by this observation, that Frankl's conviction and thought was based on belief. He says it himself, moreover. It can only be based on a belief, since science says the opposite. The science of Frankl's time, and very largely until recently, science was materialist, determinist, reductionist. That is to say, there is no non-material dimension in man, so what is this theory based on? And so, I was a little embarrassed, but as I was interested at the same time in the history of science, in the philosophy of science, I noticed that for several decades, there were works that were appearing, and from very respectable people in the field, very respected, who were beginning to formulate theories, hypotheses that were nevertheless quite widely different and new. And that's where I spent a lot of time trying to understand, and I'm not very sure I succeeded, especially in quantum physics. So I reassure myself by saying that even physicists say that no one understands quantum physics. But I still tried a little to understand what all these scientists who were asking new questions meant, what today's science represents, what is the universe that today's science talks about. And I realized that, based on the writings of people like Bernard Diaz-Spagnat, Gene Staun, Roger Penrose, well, people anyway, who we can quote without blushing, that it is no longer absurd to make some non-materialist hypotheses of science that no longer disqualify Frankl's thought. And so I found it a shame to let Frankl's thinking continue to be penalized by this background, that finding a meaning to one's life in a universe that has no meaning, that is to say, to put it another way, seeking a meaning to one's life in a context where life has no meaning, weakens Frankl's message a little bit. I found it a shame not to emphasize now to all interested people that this fact was no longer so categorical. That is to say that today we can reasonably say, and competent people say it, that we can seek a meaning to one's life in a world where it is not excluded that life has a meaning. And so that is what fascinated me. I don't know if I answered your question, Penelope.
And on the other hand, Henri Gillet, for you, can logotherapy, in your opinion, help society and businesses as a whole to ultimately evolve in the right direction, if there is indeed a right direction?
So that's my conviction. That's what I'm trying to describe. But why? First of all, in the business world, as I said, logotherapy, already medically, in terms of psychotherapy, can provide support. It's a psychotherapy of support, logotherapy is. That is to say that for certain serious pathologies, psychoses, it is obviously not enough. But in the face of burnout, anxiety attacks, depression, it is an excellent accompanying therapy, which allows people not to only depend on chemistry and treatments, which are essential in certain cases, but which change their way of seeing their life at work, and which makes it easier for them to find a way to enjoy it. Then logotherapy in the business world is also a kind of preventive medicine, preventive psychology. That is because people take a step back, because in logotherapy there is this phenomenon of distancing yourself. That is to say, there is a retrospection. But there is a kind of self-distancing to take with one's own position. That is to say, one must know oneself, observe oneself, and look at what in us relates to the satisfaction of impulses, instincts, fears, the need to satisfy the ego, etc. And this better self-knowledge allows us to distance ourselves from what we can experience in the world of work. There are still quite a few cases of burnout that are linked to too much proximity or difficulty in keeping our distance from the workplace. So, I think people who have internalized this vision of Frankl's man are much better equipped to face the world of work and the pressures that exist there. And then, third point in the business world, I experienced it very practically in the world of management. I believe that using existential analysis, that is to say no longer the therapeutic version, but the vision of man version, as a theory of motivation in the world of work, it seems to me much simpler, much more promising, and in my opinion, much more effective than the other management methods that I have known. Because it is still based on this idea that work is an important part of life, and that seeking meaning in one's life will also involve seeking meaning in one's work. And seeking meaning in one's work for oneself is exercising one's freedom. It is exercising one's responsibility. It is exercising one's free will, one's humanity, by surpassing oneself, by doing things that are not centered on us, that do not seek to make us shine, that do not seek to bring us only advantages, but that rather seek to push us to surpass ourselves. And then beyond oneself, it is also, I believe, an excellent management style. That is to say, it is understanding that our employees need meaning in their work, and that it is not authority or the use of sometimes somewhat simple tools that are the reward, the pleasure of ego, of status, etc. But something of another order and much deeper, much more real, which is that our employees also want to find in their work something that gives them the feeling of feeling alive, the desire to talk to their children with pride about what they do at work, the feeling of being useful. And not just to earn bonuses or move up to the next promotion. I mean that it is a vision of man in business that seems to me much more relevant and in my opinion more effective than some that are practiced today, whatever people might say. And I would like, since it comes to mind, to cite an example that struck me not so long ago. There are some large companies now, perhaps yours, which, in order to recruit valuable people, in particular people who come from top schools, significant and interesting human resources, have realized that because there is a demand, it is a part of the youth that is attractive, there is a demand to feel useful, there is a demand for meaning. And there are companies that offer people who recruit, for example, a week of volunteering during the year, during working hours. That is to say, we tell them, here, if you are recruited by us, you do your job, but we offer you and pay you a week in Haiti or in Africa, etc., to do volunteer work. Which means a lot. This means, first of all, that there are young people who are looking, including in the world of work, for something other than earning a good living. This means that the companies realize this and would like to have these people, which confirms, in a certain way, the relevance of Frankl's approach. And I would just like to say with some regret that it is a bit of a shame that we are giving these young recruits a week where they feel useful elsewhere in the world, when perhaps we should work on how to do things so that they feel useful all year round at work inside the company. So, these are the comments I wanted to make for business and the search for meaning at work.